The death of the troubled Philip Bowen had been an upsetting business. Mrs. Prosser couldn't deny it. As she told her old friend Nellie Dams, whenever she looked around his empty room, she could still imagine him reading intently and then feverishly writing in his diary. It was marvellous how a young man could do such things, all that writing. But an empty room was no good to her. Times were difficult enough as it was, without there being no money coming in from what everyone knew was a very well-appointed room. However, a chance conversation with a neighbour, Mr. Kane, brought to her lodging house his nephew, George May. It was a ghastly mistake. A greater contrast with Philip Bowen could not be imagined. George was coarse, aggressive, and prone to heavy drinking and violence. His urgent need for lodgings had been prompted by his mother evicting him. She was no longer prepared to have George in the family home on Richardson Street, a short distance away. It was later agreed that it was unfortunate that no one had found the time to tell Mrs. Prosser just what she was letting herself in for. It did not take long for the full extent of her mistake to reveal itself. George spent all of Wednesday afternoon and evening in a drinking session with some of his friends. They'd been unloading a consignment of flour from a ship in the South Dock, and once paid, had repaired to their favourite illegal drinking den in Sandfields. His anger at his eviction sat heavily upon him, and the more that he drank, the more outraged he became at such unexpected maternal rejection. He decided that it would be a good idea to discuss the issue once again with her, but when he staggered up to her house, he was shocked to discover that his mother seemed disinclined to forgive him, especially considering the state he was in. Even worse was to follow, for George was astonished when she claimed to find his obviously reasonable behaviour threatening and called for police assistance. Constables Bingham and Francis were quickly on the scene and manfully ejected George from the house and threw him onto the road, satisfied by a job well done. George May, however, made brave by beer, was keen to revenge himself on the police officers. He struck Constable Francis, kicked Constable Bingham, and then, with his companions, they ran untidily to Mrs. Prosser's on Nicol Street, where they made a stand against the officers who had chased them, throwing stones from the poorly made road which provides such a richness of material. A crowd gathered to enjoy the entertainment, while Mrs. Prosser hid in the kitchen at the back of the house and sobbed with shame. Baglow was quickly on the scene. For him, it was the perfect commotion, a riot without a shadow of a doubt, entirely appropriate for a town with a rotten heart. When he looked around and saw that an off-duty Inspector Bucke had been alerted by the noise and was running the short distance from Constant White's rooms, he could not have been more pleased. He stepped backwards into a doorway and watched the inspector quickly restore order. He saw him grab May and pin him to the wall, allowing Constable Francis to handcuff him, an act that caused his friends to scatter in different directions. Order had been suddenly restored, and George May was dragged without ceremony to the police cells, screaming threats at his mother until he was sick in the road. This was a good moment, Baglow decided, and he stepped back out onto the pavement. "Good evening, Inspector. It must be disappointing to have your piano practice interfered with," he said, shaking his head. "I imagine you were in the middle of a very tricky arpeggio. Something like that, anyway." "Any comments for the Cambrian, sir?" "Good evening, Mr. Baglow. You're not part of this gang of ruffians, are you?" Baglow decided to ignore him. "How disappointed were you to see your constables trapped by a vicious stone-throwing mob? Do you have any thoughts about the terrible levels of lawlessness in the town?" "For goodness sake, Mr. Baglow, is that a yes or a no, Inspector? Do you have any thoughts about it? Or do you not? There's been a domestic incident, and so you have no comment to make about the increase in crime in the town. I see. Tell me, Inspector, Some of this large crowd of youths, there were 4 of them, Mr. Baglow, members of this large and unruly mob, ran away, and you did nothing to prevent it. Do you intend to continue with this new policy of allowing criminals to escape? Do you think this might cause alarm? Mr. Baglow, you were here. I imagined that you might have seen what happened. So, you don't know whether it will cause alarm or not. Interesting. How much does the Watch Committee know about this new policy you've implemented, I wonder? He could see that he was starting to make the inspector flustered and angry. This was not a bad idea at all. Do you agree that our constables are too frightened of the criminal classes to be effective? Mr. Baglow, I'm off duty. If you have any questions, once again, is that a yes or a no? Buck took a deep breath. If you have any questions relating to the nature of policing in the town, then please address them to the Chief Constable at your earliest opportunity. Thank you. As I said, I am currently off duty. And would you agree then, Inspector Buck, that your own leisure activities are more important than the maintenance of law and order in the town? Ridiculous question, said Buck, who then instantly regretted allowing Baglow to goad him. Good evening, Mr. Baglow, he said, and walked away. Baglow had enjoyed himself. The interview, if that's what it could be called, had gone extremely well. He knew that Buck hadn't been ready for the questions at all. If he had been in uniform, then perhaps his responses would have been more measured. But now Baglow returned as quickly as possible to his room to write down the words whilst they were still fresh in his mind.